common sense. Tonight, we're going to talk about the fact that a lot of people have a lot of book knowledge, but they have no spiritual common sense on how to use it. And so when you think about it, what we were taught to keep learning and memorizing and understanding and not obeying, all of a sudden we realize now, yes, we're supposed to learn all this, but as we learn it, we're supposed to be obedient to it. And so what does that look like? What is obedience? What does obedience mean? You know, a little boy was told one time by his dad, said, if you sit up in that high chair one more time, I'm going to tan your backside. The little boy looked at his dad and said, Dad, I may be sitting down on the outside, but I'm still standing up on the inside. Is that obedience? No. That's keeping the rules. Obedience is when I follow what God actually meant. Not what I think it means. Not what I hope it means. Not what somebody told me it might mean. But when I really study the Bible and I learn what God says and what God really wants from me, and then I follow total and complete obedience with that. Now tonight, let's look at our chart. God is always at work around us. He desires a loving relationship with us. Now there'll be people who miss this. And they would say, oh, I have a great relationship. No, with this person. No, it's a relationship with God. It is a pure relationship, not an emotional relationship. It is an honest, true relationship where God convicts and God speaks and God touches. And then He invites you into His work. And He speaks to you through church, circumstances, the Scriptures. He guides you to a certain place. And then you come to a crisis of belief. Am I going to obey Him? Or am I going to do what I think I want to do, or what I think is best? Am I willing to adjust my life to what God says? Am I willing to make those hard adjustments? And tonight we come to the final one, of course, and that's where we're at, is obedience and willing to be obedient to Him in everything that He wants us to do. So let's just look tonight at where we're headed. We experience God through obedience, not through other things. How? You obey Him. He accomplishes His work through you. And so what we must stop and realize that we don't experience God in worship. Now, we're taught to worship God, but that's not where we experience God. You know, sometimes if the band gets the music right, we get the beat going, you can about convince folks of anything. Is that true? Is that worship, or is that just going through the motions? That's just going through the motions of emotionalism. Fact of the matter is, you know, you can do all those things, but when the Bible clearly says this is what you must do, there's no ands, no ifs, no opposites, no maybes, no parentheses that says you don't have to do it in case of these things. You and I must obey Him. He accomplishes His work through you. There's a lot of God's work that can be done if you're willing to be the vessel. Now, if you don't have the right relationship with God and you're not willing to make the adjustments, then you are a plug in the conduit of God. So you and I must come to know God by experiencing Him through obedience. Turn very quick to John 14. Now, we've looked at John 14 before. Sometimes I think John 14 and 15 may be the whole study of this book. But notice that He teaches us there some very important truths that we need to grasp onto. The first one, notice in John 14:15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Now, John 14, that's wrong up there, so don't worry about that. Worry about John 14:15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Now, notice if you would on down to verse 24. Verse 24 says, whosoever does not love me does not keep my words. And the word that you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me. Now, catch this. You and I must understand something. If we really love God, then we will what? Obey Him. And if we don't obey Him, then we don't love Him. Is that harsh? I would say more it's grim, wouldn't you? It's a grim reality. That sometimes in my life, in your life, we talk about loving God as long as it meets the criteria of what we don't mind doing. But it's when God says, obey me. You listen and you obey me. And you keep saying, no, I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to do what I got to do. All of a sudden, man, God says, you don't love me like you ought to. You know, Phyllis and I made a rule years ago in our marriage, in our relationship. We would never say to each other, you'll do this if you love me. Now it's kind of a joke when we do it. Because we know that's a rule. We're not allowed to say those words. The reason being is sometimes that's used for manipulation. God's not going to manipulate us. What God is going to say to us is this. Here's my commandments. Will you obey me? If you love me, you will obey me. Somebody else is reading back there.
I'm pushing the wrong button.
Old people and buttons. It's always dangerous.
Hey, I'd be better than that.
Explore experiencing God through obedience. So we know that if we want to experience God, it's not going to come by just reading my Bible. It's not going to come by just praying. It's not going to come by just doing, what I feel like I ought to do. It's going to be an intense relationship with God that says I want to experience God through being obedient, totally obedient to Him. Now, there is a difference between having Jesus as your friend and you being a friend of Jesus. Let me say that again. There is a broad difference between you having Jesus as your friend and you being a friend of Jesus. Have any of you ever had a friend that was a really good friend when they needed you, but when you needed them, they seemed to disappear? Anybody had a friend like that? That's how Jesus' friends often are. And that includes who? Us. Because we talk about, what a friend we have in Jesus. So true. But when He asks of us, we say, well, Lord, I can't do that. You can't expect that of me. I've got this going in my life, and I got this going, and I'm at this stage of my life, and you don't expect that of me. God doesn't expect that of me. And the Bible doesn't say He doesn't expect it. We just can't told ourselves that He didn't expect it. Matthew chapter 12, verse 50. Don't turn there, just listen. For whosoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and my sister and my mother. The question came up, who is your brother and sister? And Jesus made it really clear that His family are those who do the will of the Father in heaven. Not those who just do what they want to do, but literally do the will of God. There's a lot of tragedy in our culture. There's a lot of times when people talk spiritual, or they've been in church all their life, and they think that brings them to some place of spiritual depth. And all it's done is made them more rebellious against the things of God. And so what we have to realize is if I want a true friendship relationship with God, that must be built off more than just me keeping some rules or going through I got to understand what I'm talking about. I got to know what I'm talking about when I speak about Him. because I want to be his friend. I want to show him I love him by my obedience to him. 1 John chapter 2, again, you have to turn there, I'll read it to you. Said, for by this we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments. And that's a powerful verse. Because John says, if you don't obey Jesus, you don't know him. And what have you and I been taught over the years? Oh, you get saved, and then you got to grow into this relationship where you become a little more obedient. And you do a little, no. When you get saved, you surrender to lordship. You call him Lord at that moment. Now, every step you take away from that is your own self-will. But every one of us who truly know Jesus Christ started in total obedience to him in lordship, and whatever happened after that is our own. Whosoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. It is impossible to love Jesus and know Jesus and be ready for heaven and continue to practice habitual sins. I don't care how much we talk. I don't care how much we play the game. That's what John said. I didn't write it. But whosoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him. What gives us assurance that we're his friends is the fact that we are obedient to him. Now, I want you to also notice that Jesus clearly says, when I look to see who's a friend of mine, there is one thing I look for, and that's obedience. Remember, John records in his gospel those great I am passages where Jesus said, I am the bread, I am the light of the world, I'm the gate, I'm the good shepherd, I'm the resurrection and the life, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the true vine. All those great passages. But in every one of them, there is a response back that says, I will obey in order to get the bread. And people say, that's work salvation. Absolutely not. You and I do not do one thing to get saved, except trust Christ. But if we truly get saved, then there is a production in our lives of faith, obedience. Is it total obedience? No, there's going to be all kinds of growing pains and growing areas. But we're like a baby. When we're born perfect. A baby's born how? With all the crud? No, it's born very what? Innocent. Is that true? I mean, do you all know any baby born to be a thief? Born to be a liar? Born to be a murderer? No. All babies are born very innocent. But in long until you got to teach that baby what? What not to do. Instead of what to do. Why is that? Because of our human nature. And that same battle in our spiritual life is in that nature. So you and I must understand that when God looks at his friends, he's looking for those who are obedient to him. There is no substitute for obedience. Worship is not a substitute for obedience. I jumped the gun a moment ago. Prayer is not a substitute for obedience. Let me ask you a couple questions here, just conversational. If there's no substitute for obedience, do you think there's ever a Sunday here at the Grove when we have obedient people trying to worship? Or disobedient people trying to worship? Let me ask it again. You all look like you're confused. First of all, I gotta get my wake up. No, I haven't taken that. Do you think during worship time on Sunday morning at the Grove, there's ever a time when there are disobedient people with us trying to worship?
Statistics said yes.
Not statistics, how about us? See, what we learned in church was we always try to kick it off to somebody else. It could be us who's disobedient. How about prayer? Are there folks who pray who are disobedient to God every day? Absolutely.
Yes.
Now they say they're praying. Now, you know, the Bible talks about sin hindering our prayers. But I will say this, that's not a substitute for obedience. Somebody said, oh, I pray every day, I walk with God every day, so you know, he understands, and I understand him. No. There's none of those relationships. That is not in the Bible. That is a man-made myth. Obedience. The kids used to sing the song on Softy. You may remember the Softy thing?
Yeah.
Obedience. Obedience is the very best way to know that, show that you believe. Well, I'm bad on singing, but anyway, I've been on YouTube now singing. That's good. Maybe I'll get a record. You never know. Not a record. What are they called today? CD. I think it's past that, isn't it? But anyway, what we have to understand is what Jesus said in Matthew 21. Now, just again, you want to turn there. We'll just look at it together. Verse 28. What do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he went to the first and said, Son, go and work in the vineyard today. And he answered, I will not. But afterwards he changed his mind and went. And he went to another son and said to the same. And he answered and said, I will go, sir, but did not go. And of course the question is, which one of them was the obedient son? The first one. How many times does God say to us, I want you to be obedient? I want you to obey. And our first response is always, no. And then we go do it. But how many other responses is, yeah, Lord, I'll do whatever you want me to do. Well, wait a minute, that was hard. Couldn't do it, Lord. Got that call from work. Couldn't do it, Lord. Well, you know, there's this virus going around. I got a cough. I couldn't do it, Lord, because, well, family came up. You know, family's really important. Right? No. See, we find a reason to say, yes, God, I will, and then, no, God, I'm not. And I dare say most of us find ourselves not as son 1, but as son 2. Willing to say yes to the Father, and then not carrying it out. Very, very crucial that we don't substitute worship, prayer, whatever it is, good deeds, for true obedience. I'm so glad there comes a point where you don't need to pray anymore. You just need to obey. Let me tell you the greatest cop-out in the American church. Y'all ready for it? You might want to write it down. This is profound. You ready? Well, let me pray about it. What does that mean? Let me pray about it. What that says is, number 1, I'm not going to make the decision when. Right now. Number 2, I got to sound what? I got to sound spiritual about it. And number 3, I'm probably not going to do it. Why? Because you already know you're supposed to obey. You already decided, I'm not going to obey, but I got to figure out how I'm not going to do it and still have a spiritual side. Listen, God loves that first son who said no, but then was obedient. I mean, if you don't believe it, just read the book of Jonah. I mean, Jonah chapter 1 is a bad testimony about obeying God. But when he's in that well in chapter 2, he's a different boy. Obedience says, I'm going to follow God. Wherever you lead, I'll go. Whatever you say, I'll do. Too often, we have spiritualized the unspiritual. We've made it all dramatic and awesome. No, it's just being obedient. A holy God. By the way, God will not entrust you with anything else if you continue to violate His holiness. It's a very important part of the spiritual journey, is learning that God is holy, and therefore you and I are required in that to protect holy obedience. Not perfection, but holy obedience. Now, how do you experience the joy of your master? You obey him. The problem with many believers are they don't want a master. They want to be the master. And if not them being the master, they at least want to have what? Say. Some say in this thing. I mean, it's my life. No. Our lives don't belong to us anymore. Our lives belong to who? According to the Bible, who's your life belong to if you're a believer? The Lord. It's not yours. So how do you experience joy? Most folks don't know what joy is. Most people think it's anger. It's winning. Some people believe it's frustration. I mean, if you did what God told you to do and was being obedient, would it so frustrate you to adjust your life to what God is saying instead of what you want or desire? See what I'm saying? But joy is when you are obedient and you know that you have been totally, fully, solely, completely obedient to God. Let's keep going back. How do you experience? Look at this one. When God speaks, you need to obey Him. Here's the hard part. You ready? And leave the results and the consequences to who?
Yeah, God.
Anybody want to say, whew, that's a tough one? Because you see, there are a lot of folks. We just had another Andy. There's a lot of folks who live their spiritual lives believing they need to reason themselves out. They need to figure themselves out. In other words, they need to know, if I do this, this will happen. And if this happens, then it's all bad for, it's going to be bad. If I'm obedient to God, it's really going to be bad. If I hold the truths of Scripture, then the results will be bad. You and I can't live thinking we get to choose how the results turn out, the consequences. You say, well, if I'd have done this, I couldn't live with myself. Then you don't have the joy of the Lord. For the joy of the Lord is obedience to Him, and He gets the rest figured out in a powerful way. So hard to learn the joy of consequences. I've had people that, was angry at me in churches over things, and I knew they were probably going to leave because they was angry at me or angry at what went on or angry at something I'd taught. And there's a part of you that, I remember as a young preacher, I'd want to try to console them. And I learned consoling those type folks is like petting a rattlesnake. It's going to finally what? It's going to finally bite you. And so what I had to learn was, be obedient to the Scriptures. What's the Bible say about this? I mean, Phyllis can remember a lady who got up and walked out of my office and pointed at me and her and said, I don't care what you all say, I don't care what that Bible says, I'm going to do what I want to do. And she's still miserable to this very moment. Because she wouldn't trust God for the right results. and the right circumstances, you or I can never play God, and that's what gets us all in trouble. We say, well, I have to cave in here. I've got to cave in here, because if I don't cave in here, then something bad might happen. You and I don't have the authority to cave. Number one, we don't belong to ourselves. Who do we belong to? And if we belong to God, then we must live by the authorization of what? His Word. And let me tell you something. That's not a casual, brief, emotional comment. That's walking your life through every difficult hour, always being obedient to what God says. So, what do? We adjust. And we obey. Now, this is all easier said than done. Obedience is always the avenue through which you can find a greater fellowship and intimacy with God. Oh, man. When you're obedient, really obedient, the walls open up a fellowship. And there is this joy of fellowship that just ravishes in your life. It's different. It's amazing. But when you're disobedient, it closes up. Opens up. And the beautiful thing is, obedience is where God wants us. He wants us to be able to experience everything about Him. And the real plug up in our spiritual journey is us. We try to outthink God, we try to outfaith God, we try to outlive God, we try to outdo God. And what needs to happen, what goes wrong in our lives, is we just get in trouble. You see, what happens when you're totally obedient to God and the doors close? What happens? What happens? What do you do?
You do what you do.
What we learned this week in Acts 16 about that? When God shuts a door, you can't. What have we been taught? If you're faithful, you'll keep what? You'll keep trying to get the door open. You'll kick the door, ram the door, beat the door, shove the door. You'll call everybody and his brother and help knock the door down. Why? Because we're faithful. And we want to be faithful to God. And we want to complete the task. Is that true? And God said, no. I don't want that door open. Shut the door. You ever say to your kid, shut the door. You said, but God, I want to open that door. Shut the door. Here's the door you go. Because you see, when things start going the wrong direction, God clarifies what He's saying. God wants to clarify to us exactly where we ought to be. In 2004, when I filed for the Kentucky State Senate, I have never been more sure that I did the right thing than when I dropped those papers off at the Secretary of State's office in Frankfort, Kentucky. Never had a doubt. And Phyllis was with me that night when I lost the election that night. I had the same peace I had when I was driving down the road after I dropped papers off. I knew I'd been obedient. Little did I know that chain of events would bring me to Nashville, bring me to final command, bring me to the Grove Church. I'm just convinced if we listen to God and be obedient to Him, He will clarify what He's saying. Keep silent to what has been said about other things. Let Him work out the details. Anybody got a problem with God working out the details? Anybody else like to work out the details for God? Anybody in here like that? Yeah. How many of us are in here like that? Let's be hand of honesty. Well, we gotta work them out. They gotta be our plan. You see, do all you know to do. Wait on the Lord till He tells you the next step. That's the hardest thing you'll ever do. Is wait for God to clarify. Just keep being obedient to what He has said in the past. Let Him work out all the details. Do what you know to do right there in that spot. And then wait for the next information. What happens if you jump ahead? Okay, I'm going to make an open confession here, and the kids will amen this, and Phyllis may even enjoy this. When I get on a computer and I start getting these little windows pop up, I just go to clicking, don't I, Phyllis? And what do you say?
Read before you click.
Now say it like you really say it.
Would you please read that before you
There we go. And I only click 2 more before I stop. We do I have to go through all that again. It is that thought process that says, I got to know what the next step is. That can be so breaking to doing the will of God. Because you don't know what God's got next. You don't know where God has you. Waiting. Listen. Maybe the most difficult thing you've ever done. See, the greatest single way you can engage in spiritual warfare is to obey whatever God tells you to do. In Luke chapter 10, the 24 verses, we won't go through those. But they do give us the scenario. The 70 going out, how we ought to live our lives in obedience. And the disciples were even amazed at what happened in obedience. Because when they realized who Jesus was, and they began to grasp who He was, and they began to grasp that their faith was more than the rituals they'd been taught as kids, but now here is the Messiah. Here is Yahweh in the flesh with Elohim. Here is Jehovah God, Emmanuel. And in His name, He cast out demons. And in His name, all the imps of hell flee. That changed their thought process. And God help us. We need to see that in our own life. We need to have people delivered from where they are. We need to have people separated from what's taking place in their life. We need a time where we allow true deliverance to take place in people's lives, and we become a part of that. We're not standing off to the side saying, "You need Jesus? Hey, you need Jesus?" No, we're investing in their lives as God gives them to us, and we wait for that next opportunity to share our faith and to reach people and to touch lives. Somebody said we gave out 1,000 baskets and didn't reach one person. It's okay. 1,001 may be the one that God intended. You never know where God has you. Now, if I'm passing out baskets because it makes me feel good to pass out baskets, then I'm no better than the social worker on the street corner. The difference is when I'm passing out the baskets, because I believe God led me to an access ministry that's going to lead me to a man of peace, that's going to lead me to my Bible study and my evangelism out there in the culture. And let me back up what I said. I said evangelism. I'm talking about discipleship. We don't separate those here. There's no such thing as evangelism and discipleship. Evangelism is discipleship, along with a broader picture of discipleship. Does that make sense? We used to talk about the evangelistic arm of the church. That's a very poor terminology. Because everything we do ought to be discipling people, what God taught us in His book. Everything we do ought to be discipling others to Christ. And what we must understand about that is, if I want to engage in spiritual warfare, then I must be obedient when God tells me what to do. See, a lot of people want to look like great spiritual warriors. But when it comes time to be obedient to what God says, the vocal goes down and there's nothing there. You know, it's easy to talk. It's different to live. In the Christian faith, disciples are to live out their faith by sharing the gospel, by making an impact. God bringing people into our lives. It's not that we're just out there looking for everybody and saying, hey, let me tell you about it, let me tell you about it, let me tell you. No, we're out there and God is at work around us. And we must have such a relationship with Him that when He invites us to go speak to someone, He clearly guides us there. And then we must make the adjustment in our lives. Will I spend this time? Will I be willing to sacrifice myself? Will I be willing to put myself out there? Crisis of belief. And then the adjustment comes. But I've still not been obedient. So I began to investigate and share in that individual's life. Don't ever blame anyone else for your disobedience. When I read that, I had to laugh. I think about Bob Harrington. Anybody remember Bob Harrington?
Oh, yeah.
He didn't end so well, but he turned out, after he got out of jail, to be a comedian. But he was a comedian, he was a preacher back. He was a chaplain of Bourbon Street back in the 70s. And he told the story about going, meeting a 300-pound man, and he said, why don't you receive Christ? Guy said, I can't stop drinking. He said, why can't you stop drinking? He said, it's my wife. She causes me to drink. He said, so I want to meet her. He said, I got there and she weighed about 90 pounds, and here's this 300-pound guy is, and we sit down, and I talked to him about 20 minutes with her in the room, leaned over and said, hey, pour me one too. So, you see, disobedience can't be blamed on somebody else. You and I can't say, well, you understand, I'd have been obedient. But Phyllis wasn't. And so therefore, because we're spouses, I had to be disobedient with her. People play that game all the time. Or, I'd have been obedient, but the preacher wasn't, so therefore, I'm good. Right? Do we ever play that game? Sure we do. Don't ever blame someone else for you being disobedient. No matter how much you want to, no matter how much it may free you to feel that way, feeling free of it doesn't stop it. It's still a guilty moment. And in our culture, we spend a lot of time blaming someone else, don't we? Now, how many people do they blame? A lot of murderers blame their parents. A lot of people say, well, it was the house or the school I grew up in, or the neighborhood I grew up in, or whatever it may be. You can't blame anyone else for your disobedience. You have all the power of heaven available to you to obey anything God tells you to do. Now that ought to free up everything, shouldn't it? I mean, think about the God who created heaven and earth. Think about the God who parted the sea and let the 2 million people walk on dry ground and drowned the Pharaoh's army. Think about the God who held the sun back while Joshua fought the battle. I'm just starting getting Jericho and Joshua mixed up. That'd been bad. Well, they're not mixed up anyway. And what mentioned Jericho, I mean, God allows them to march 13 times in 7 days around the wall, and guess what happens? It collapses. And it really didn't fall in or out. It appears it went straight. I mean, it's amazing how that happened. If he can do all of that, why can't he do those things for us? Now, let me stop you. We're not talking about medical. We're not talking about financial. We're not talking about power. We're talking about obedience to God to further the kingdom of God. Big difference. And I truly believe, I said this last week and I'll say it again, our testimony time in church we have lived so beneath the spiritual privilege that we rejoice over physical things. Because we don't have a lot of spiritual things to rejoice about. Not very many people being obedient, going out and reaching and touching lives. You say, well, I'd like to do something, but I don't know and pray about it. Has God spoke to you about it? Most of us are not going to go down the street and win somebody to Jesus. Most of us are going to have an access ministry in our culture. We used to go knock on doors, now you just get bullets back. And people don't want you in their homes. They don't need you in their homes. But what they do need, what they need in their community, is tangible stuff that we get to share with them. Not just to give them something, but so that you share the gospel. We never give anything with just the fact of giving it away. That's never healthy. That's not what God put the church here for. That's socialism. That's what we call social gospel. That's a watered down gospel. But every time you do an access ministry, it is so that you can share, you meet a need so you can share the gospel just like Jesus. I mean, what are the needs? What are needs in the community? As you pray, what are the needs? That will be our first prayer of obedience. God, what are the needs in our community? What are the needs that we could reach out and touch somebody's life with that make an impact? I talk about the food truck. The reason I talk about the food truck is I believe God gives an opportunity to go into communities to do discovery Bible studies through those trucks. Well, everybody? No, but somebody. If we meet a man of peace, and what a man of peace is not just somebody who lets us share the gospel with them or do a Bible study with us, but they're connected in the community and bring others with them. We desperately need to go back and trust Him. Phyllis, I think somewhere in the book, and I should have mentioned this to you earlier, is the verses to trust and obey. Is that on one of the pages there? Remember, God's desire is for a relationship with us. A relationship that bursts out of obedience. You know, I've never desired my children to obey me just so I could have the power of them obeying me. But I've always desired them to obey me so that our relationship would be stronger. Now, that's the same is true with God. God is not wanting us to be obedient so He lords over us. He wants us to be obedient so the relationship is stronger, purer, richer, fuller. And you got to will you lead us and let's sing together.
When we walk with the Lord in the light of His word, what glory He sheds on our way. Let us do His good will. He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey.
Trust and obey. I remember every time we sing that, I think about where I remember that song from. That was a little boy. This goes back a long time because Louisa Church didn't do Sunday school assemblies probably in the last 50 years, so it's been longer than that. We used to have a Sunday school assembly every Sunday morning. That's where all the late people could show up late. We'd sing, take an offering. My grandmother had me out there a half hour early. And we'd sing that song every Sunday morning. Remember that, Phyllis? Mm-hmm. And that was some good days. But I never realized then as a kid that song would mean so much to me all of my life. Trust and obey. Remember, God is always at work around you. You're not in a dry field. Jesus said, what did he say? Truly the harvest is white, but the laborers are you. And then God desires the relationship with you. And that relationship is not you talking to him all the time. We've learned that through this study. But it's stopping and listening to God. And that's probably one of the hardest things you've ever done. Is to stop the ritual you've been taught all your life and let God speak. Mm-hmm. And then remember, he's going to give you an invitation. Once that relationship is where it needs to be, come join him in the work. Now, that's not a calling to preach. That's not a calling. That is somebody needs help. There is a ministry somewhere. You can go reach somebody. There is a place for you in the kingdom of God. It's not something you're going to do at the church. It's something you're going to do out there to advance the kingdom. And then he'll speak to you in that invitation. Remember, he may use church, he may use circumstances, he may use the scriptures, but he will speak to you. And then you'll come to a crisis of belief. And some people say, oh, I'd never have, I'd just be so obedient. You're already in a crisis of belief when you make that statement. The great people of God had a crisis of belief, and we're no better than them. You will have a crisis of belief. And what you must do is be willing to adjust yourself, not God adjust to you. You see, that's one of the things about goes over to relationship and prayer. If you do all the talking, you're always trying to convince God to adjust to what you want. Has anybody ever prayed that kind of prayer? God, I want you just over here to me. And you didn't say that, but you'd say, I prayed a certain way. Remember? You know, TV preachers will say, you pray this way. And you always say, in Jesus' name, I believe. And it's going to what? Amen. Yeah. I won't. If it's not God's will, it's not going to happen. And let me tell you about the will of God. The will of God is advancing the kingdom of God. He wants to reach the world with the gospel. And folks, that's doing the will of God, is adjusting our lives to an obedient and experience the joy of obeying him. The joy of watching people come to Christ. The joy of discipling folks and watching them then go disciple others. If I got 100 in my heart tonight, it's so that I can reach people who will go disciple and disciple others. And we began a discipling process. She mentioned John Keene a moment ago. My 2 years with John Keene, John has birthed that in my heart, this multiplying discipleship. Because of the fact that he so cast the vision that I always thought if I won one here, and won here, and won here, and won here, and won here, we was doing pretty good. We baptized every week. It'd be wonderful. No, we ought to be baptizing hundreds every week. I mean, this many people. How many we got in here tonight? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. There's 17 of us. What's 8 times 17? Somebody tell me real quick.
About 136.
Okay, good job, Miss Joy. Now, what's 8 times 136?
Oh, come on, give me a break.
1088.
1,088. All right, what's 8 times 1,088? Come on.
8,704.
All right. See, that ought to be done in the next 6 months.
Get right on it.
I mean, realistic, if God is who he says he is, and he's as big as we say he is, and he does all these miracles, and he wants to reach all these people, it's God's will to reach them. Where's the clog up? Does that make sense? You see, but if we reach them that quick, they won't be strong disciples. Let me tell you something. If you start from the premise that they need to obey what they know about the Bible, and you teach them that, they'll get a lot of the rest of it a lot quicker than memorizing 7 things so-and-so wrote in a book to try to help us. You understand what I'm saying? Because you go back to book learning versus just good, common, spiritual discipleship sense. Taking the Bible and not twisting it and turning it for your own self-indulgence, but literally practicing what thus saith the Lord. Well, you can disconnect us. We say bye to all the folks on YouTube. Hope people feel better, and I hope I keep feeling good.